Hi, welcome to Blogging Theology. Today we're pleased to speak to Dr. Ryan Mullins. How are you, Ryan?
Doing good.
Have you back on.
Yeah, thank you for having me again.
Dr. Ryan Mullins has a PhD in theology from the University of St. Andrews. He also has a habilitation in dogmatics from the University of Helsinki. He has published over 50 essays on various topics in philosophical theology related to models of God, philosophy of time, personal identity, the problem of evil, disability theology, the Trinity, and the Incarnation. He has published two books, The End of the Timeless God, published by Oxford University Press in 2016, and God in Emotion, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. Dr. Mullins has held research and teaching fellowships at the University of Notre Dame, the University of Cambridge, the University of St. Andrews, the University of Edinburgh, and the University of Helsinki. He is currently lecturer of philosophy at the University of Lucerne in Switzerland and also visiting professor of philosophy at Palm Beach Atlantic University. And we'll do a little plug as requested. The University of Lucerne offers an online master's program in philosophy, theology, and religions. Students get a robust education in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic philosophy. It is intellectually rigorous, yet incredibly affordable. And you can talk to Ryan if you want to know more. Now, for thousands of years until our time today, theologians have been debating a whole host of issues. And one area in which there is rich and seemingly endless disagreement is the nature of God. Can we understand the nature of God, even if only partially by the use of our rational faculties? And if so, what kinds of conclusions can we rationally draw about God's attributes? Or are we even asking the right questions from the outset? Is it even accurate to describe God as even having attributes altogether? And these sorts of questions are not exclusively asked and debated by theologians ascribing to a particular religion. If anyone consults the works of Muslim and Christian theologians, for instance, he would clearly see that many of these recurring topics are discussed in a similar fashion with comparable dividing lines among groups disagreeing with each other. And today, God willing, we'll briefly start off by generally talking about these kinds of disagreements before diving into a particular theological doctrine that will be the focus of our discussion, namely divine simplicity. Now, when it comes to certain debates about God's nature and attributes, there are two broad camps that many theologians tend to identify with: the classical theistic camp and the neoclassical theistic camp. And so, Ryan, maybe we can start off by talking about these two camps and what each one stands for.
So they both affirm the basic concept of God. And so the basic concept of God is that of a perfect being, which is the single ultimate foundation of reality. And that's a really thin notion, but like concepts are always, kind of sparse on details. Where things get interesting is when we're talking about conceptions, or like a model. And so a model of God is where you're going to have like an articulation of what it means to be perfect, and then what it means to be the single ultimate foundation of reality. And so classical theism and neoclassical theism, those are two examples of like just different models of God, because there's others like open theism, panentheism, pantheism. But today we want to stick with just these two, these classical and neoclassical. Now, let me talk about where they agree, and then we can get into where they disagree. So both the classical and the neoclassical theists affirm that God necessarily exists. And they're both going to say God's eternal. Like no one wants to deny God's eternal. They're both going to say God has aseity. He's omnipotent, omniscient. He's perfectly good. He's perfectly rational. He's perfectly free. And then they're both going to say, look, when we say that God's perfect, this is part of what explains why God's perfect. This is why God's a perfect being. And then when it comes to the claim that God's the foundation of reality, they're going to agree on a particular articulation of that. And that's the doctrine of creation out of nothing. So the doctrine of creation out of nothing says that the universe began to exist some finite amount of time ago, prior to which there was God all alone, God and nothing else. So there is some sort of state of affairs where God exists without the universe or the multiverse, if you're into that sort of stuff. It's just God all alone. Nothing is co-eternal with God. And that's different from like a doctrine of emanation or eternal creation, where God is always existing with some sort of cosmic stuff on those sort of views. So creation ex nihilo says, no, there's nothing co-eternal alongside God. There's God all alone. That might be a timeless state of affairs, might be a temporal state of affairs, depends who you ask. And then there's God with a bunch of cosmic stuff. And so the classical theist and the neoclassical theist, they agree on all of these kinds of things. And then one final thing that they agree on is somehow God is able to have foreknowledge of the future. He creates a universe with a settled timeline. So there's stuff there for God to know, and he knows it. How God gets that knowledge, that's up for debate. But they all agree God's got this foreknowledge. So that's where they agree. So we should probably say where they disagree. So classical theism says God has 4 unique attributes, and these are timelessness, immutability, impassibility, and simplicity. And so let me say a bit about those first 3, since we'll go into simplicity in a lot more detail later. So if you want to say that God is eternal, again, like I said before, everyone says that. To be eternal is to exist without beginning and without end. Eternal does not mean timeless. When you're looking at the broad strokes of Western history, and also in Eastern religions too. Eternal just means to exist without beginning, without end. If you want God to be timeless, you need to make a few additional claims. So God is timeless if God exists without succession, so he doesn't do one thing and then another. He doesn't have temporal location, so he doesn't exist right now. And he doesn't have any sort of temporal relations. So he's not simultaneous with this moment, because if he's simultaneous with this moment, then he exists right now. He's not earlier than this moment or later than this moment, because that would all entail some sort of succession, some sort of temporal location. Now, when you're looking at this connects really nicely with the claim that God is immutable, which means God cannot change in any way, shape, or form. So God cannot undergo any sort of intrinsic change, nor any sort of extrinsic change. So extrinsic changes like relational changes, because if God underwent relational changes, that would demonstrate that there was a before and an after in his life, and that's succession, that's change. And so he wouldn't have timelessness. So this is all kind of ruled out by timelessness and immutability. Impassibility is a very strong claim. It says that it is impossible for God to be moved or influenced by anything outside of himself for his beliefs, his emotions, and his actions. So those are like the classical attributes. And like I said, we'll talk more about simplicity in a second. The neoclassical theist is different. And the way that Kevin Tempe defines neoclassical theism, it says that what you're doing is you're denying one or more of those 4 classical attributes. So an example would be T.J. Mawson at Oxford. So he wants to say simplicity and impassibility. I can't make sense of those. I don't want to affirm those, but I definitely want to say God's timeless and immutable. And so Mawson is going to fit into this sort of neoclassical camp. For me, I think you should just get rid of all 4 of those attributes and just say God's temporal, God's mutable, God's passible, and God's unified. But that's a more detailed argument to get to that kind of claim. But again, we can talk more about those attributes in a minute. But that's kind of the way you demarcate classical and neoclassical theism.
Great, thank you for that. And so, the word neo is there. So apparently, it's supposed to entail that neoclassical theism is a new stance. So when did it start gaining popularity then?
Yeah, this is a weird question. It's really bothered me for a while. So this word neoclassical theism, it makes it sound like this is just like this newfangled thing that just emerged in the 20th century. And you'll see a lot of like Christian theologians talk this way. But the terms classical and neoclassical theism, like those were coined in the 20th century by Charles Hartshorne. But what Hartshorne is describing, though these words are new, he's actually trying to describe things that are very old. And the similar kind of way that like panentheism, it was coined in the 1800s or the 18th century, but it's supposed to describe this thing that's very old and that spans the world's religions. And I want to say, yeah, that's right. And the same thing is true of neoclassical theism. It really does span the world's religions, and you can see it in lots of different like very old views. Because remember now, so a neoclassical theist is someone who affirms creation ex nihilo. They say God knows the future, and you're going to deny one or more of those classical attributes. So with that in mind, let me take you through some examples of some different people throughout history who affirm this. So the rejection of divine simplicity, like that's very popular among Islamic theologians. So in the 12th century, there's this guy Shahrastani. He's trying to outline the 3 main groups of Islamic thinkers up to that point. And he says there's the Mu'tazila, there's the compulsionists, and the attributionists. And the Mu'tazila,
just for our Muslim listeners who may not be familiar with these terms. So the compulsionists are the Jabriya, who denied free will, and the
Mm.
attributionists are sifatiya. So they're those who actually affirmed actual attributes for Allah, like the Atharis and the Asharis and the Maturidis. So, because our listeners may not be familiar with those particular terms.
This is good, and then also my pronunciations are terrible, so I'm going to need you to help me out with this. So yeah, exactly. So like the Mutazila, so they're going to say simplicity. That's true. Does God have attributes? No, 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 no. And then the attributionists, they're going to say simplicity. That's false. God does have distinct attributes. And so people like Avicenna or Ibn Sina, they're going to fall into the minority camp by affirming divine simplicity. And then people like Al-Maturidi, Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Ghazali, these sorts, they're going to fall into the majority camp by rejecting divine simplicity and affirming that God actually has these distinct attributes. And so rejecting divine simplicity, it's actually very popular because from what a lot of the Islamic scholars that I work with, they keep telling me that the majority view seems to be the Maturidi view. And I don't know if you would agree with that sort of claim, but I keep hearing this over and over again, that it's like one of the more widespread views.
In terms of affirming distinct attributes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is shared in common between the Asharis and the Maturidis and the Atharis. The Atharis are also known as the Hanbalis. So they all agree on that point.
I'm assuming that there's a lot of disagreement.
But where would the Atharis differ with the Asharis and the Maturidis is that the Asharis and Maturidis would still affirm divine timelessness, immutability, and define immutability and reject passability. Well, the Athari camp, to which Ibn Taymiyyah belongs, would deny all four. So,
right. So yeah,
he's the hardcore neoclassical theist.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. And so again, since neoclassical theism says just one or more of those attributes is wrong, I'm like, well, hey, this is like well established in history in the Islamic thought. So you're gonna have people like Al-Maturidi and Al-Ghazali, and then like all these others, they're gonna be in this neoclassical camp. And there's these other thinkers within Islam. So there's this 9th century Islamic group called the Karamists, and they affirmed divine temporality because they thought timelessness just cannot fit with creation ex nihilo. These things are not compatible. And so they're going to say temporality, God's temporal. And then you find some other thinkers here and there in the 11th and 12th century, like Ar-Razi and al-Baghdadi. And then, of course, like Ibn Taymiyyah's got a version, like a kind of account of divine temporality that's very influential in certain circles. I don't know how, I know he's controversial too in a lot of circles. I've encountered that much.
Yeah. So Fakhruddin Ar-Razi is a major, very eminent and prominent Ash'ari theologian. And the bulk of Ash'aris today will deny that he eventually adopted divine temporality. They would argue that he actually remained firm upon divine timelessness until he passed away. But a lot of people are arguing that he in fact did change his mind in one of his last theological works, Al-Matalib Al-Aliya, where he seems to have some pretty clear citations demonstrating that he became sympathetic and inclined towards divine temporality. But no, I didn't want to digress, but I just want to point out that many of the Ash'aris listening to you right now will probably be, cringing.
They'll be like, hang on. Yeah. which is normal, which I'm used to this, so that's fine. And then Baghdadi's the one that I find the most interesting. So we have at Lucerne, Olga Lenzini teaches this course on medieval Islamic thought. She has this wonderful lecture on Baghdadi and just laying out like his views on God and time, and they look really similar to Richard Swinburne's views. And so I just find this very fascinating. But that's a story for another day. So since I'm a Christian theologian, let me talk about Christianity for a minute. So neoclassical theism, it's quite old in Christianity as well. So Thomas Aquinas, he's classical theist, but his teacher, Peter of Ireland, he affirmed that God undergoes change and has passions. And that's inconsistent with simplicity, timelessness, mutability, and impassibility. And then when you get to the scientific revolution, it's very common for a lot of the English-speaking and early modern philosophers to ridicule the unintelligible notions of the schoolmen. And that's a direct quote from John Tillotson. So that's not me saying it's unintelligible, at least not saying it out loud. That's just what they're thinking. And so for like someone like Tillotson, he's going to say, look, we've got very good philosophical reasons and very good biblical reasons for saying timelessness, simplicity, these things are false. So we just go back to the biblical doctrine of God. And Isaac Newton, he's someone else who agrees with this. He thinks timelessness is just utterly mysterious. So we should just stick with the plain biblical meaning of the text where God was, is, and is to come. So he's got a past, he exists right now, and he's got to continue to exist forever and ever.
He's temporal.
Same. Yeah, so he's fully temporal. And then the stronger claim you get from Newton is that time is an attribute of God. But again, we can talk about that another day. Uh, Samuel Clarke, he is one of Isaac Newton's friends. He's working in the Church of England, and he agrees with this analysis. When he says, he's like, when I'm looking at these claims that God is pure actuality, like the stuff from Divine Simplicity that we're going to get to in more detail in a minute, he says, this is just meaningless. The people who utter these words, they either do not say anything meaningful at all, or what they intended to say was something completely different, and they failed to really say anything at all. And this is a really common thing you see during this time period among theistic philosophers in the 17th and 18th centuries. And then just before the turn of the 20th century in around Ireland and in the United Kingdom, and then in America, like there's this huge rejection of impassibility, and that just sparks this huge debate across Europe and across the US. And then by the time you get to the 1970s, theologians are just declaring, yeah, hardly anyone thinks impassibility is true anymore. It's kind of flipped a little bit since 2000s, but this is a widespread rejection amongst Christian theologians. And so, like, I could give more examples, but I'm hoping my point is clear. Is like this idea of neoclassical theism. It sounds like it's new because it's got that word neo in it, but we're talking about things that span vast portions of Western history. So it's really not that new.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so basically, you've highlighted that neoclassical theism has historical precedent. So, if that's the case, then why did it take this long to establish a substantial presence in academia and scholarship?
This is, for me, it's been like a really hard road to try to get these different models of God just identified and just say, here's like a clear term that picks out these different things. And then once you do that, I'm like, okay, fine, we can like really debate these things now that we can identify them. And it's been very difficult to get that up and running. I've had to publish a lot of different articles on each model of God to get this sort of debates up and running. And I'm starting to see the fruit of that right now. Like I'm seeing a lot more people interacting with my work. I'm seeing my work used in a lot of syllabuses in classrooms, and people starting to think through the implications of each model of God. And in fact, like, so this summer, I'm going to be teaching a summer school for PhD students in Spain just on neoclassical models of God, like model of God and theories of divine providence. So it's starting to catch on, but it's been difficult. And I think there's several reasons for why it's been so difficult, that like this really kind of prevented this from getting up and running sooner. And the first is when you're trying to come up with a taxonomy of different models of God, like that's just really difficult. You got to come up with cool names that people actually can remember, names that seem to kind of signify something. And that's difficult. So Charles Hartshorne, who I mentioned earlier, and then him and this other philosopher named Martin Rees in the 20th century, they tried to come up with this taxonomy. It was this weird letter system that was like messy and kind of convoluted, and I don't think it really made a lot of sense, and it just didn't catch on. And so that didn't work. The taxonomy that I'm working with, it comes from a 2013 book called Models of God and Alternative Ultimate Realities, edited by Janine Diller and Asa Kasher. And so that's where I get these 5 models of God that I'm working from, of classical, neoclassical, open theism, panentheism, and pantheism. And what they do is they've got thinkers who fall into each of those categories and try to show, like, here's historical thinkers from across the world's religions who fit in these categories. Here's contemporary work on it. And so it's really well done. And I think that taxonomy they came up with, it captures the sort of phenomena better that we're seeing throughout history. But let me mention a few other reasons why it's been difficult to get this up and running in academic circles. So I don't know exactly what it's like in Islamic theology because I'm such an amateur at this sort of stuff. But when I'm looking at like a lot of Christian theology, there's a lot of turf warfare that goes on.
Oh yeah, we got
there's
that.
a lot of okay. I'm assuming everybody's got that, but I don't want to accuse without like be able to back it up. But at least in the Christian tradition, like it's a lot of this, and you got a lot of ignorance, you got a lot of mudslinging going on, and then you always have these stubborn people who just don't want to engage with anyone that they disagree with. So what I see a lot of times is these people who they're ignorant of a lot of the actual history of philosophical theology, and so they just want to say like classical theism, it's just the majority view throughout all of history across all the world's religions, and no one was so stupid to deny it until like the 20th century. And then like that's when the process theologians came along and they just ruined everything. They just ruined America. They ruined, and this is the way like they talk sometimes. And a lot of times too, like sort of like with open theism, for example, like the open theists, they had these huge debates in the 20th century with the process theologians to say, here's where we agree and here's where we really, really disagree on all these things. And so I've read all these stuff. And then I find these people going, and if you disagree with me, you're just clearly a process theist. And this is why they do it, because everyone knows that process theism is a bad word. And so we all know that's like, you're the bad guy. If I can accuse you of being a dirty process theist, I win the debate automatically.
Oh, Ryan, can you just briefly explain what process theology is?
Yeah, so process theology, it's not a model of God, because the process theologians like Charles Hartshorne, for example, like will say, I'm a panentheist. And they'll, which is this, that's the most difficult model of God to figure out. Usually it's a rejection of creation out of nothing. And some kind of, there's this catchy slogan that the world is in God, but God is more than the world. What does that catchy slogan mean? I've published multiple papers trying to figure that out, and I don't know. And a lot of people consider me like one of the leading experts on panentheism. I'm like, I don't know what this is. Tell me what this slogan means. It just looks like flowery metaphors that we stole from classical theists. And I'm like, that's not helpful. But they've got this panentheistic model of God as whatever that is, plus an overall like process metaphysics where substances, that's not a fundamental category in our ontology. Instead, events are the fundamental categories in our ontology. If you can make sense of that, I can't.
I'm just pretending to be smart and nodding in approval.
Well, like this is the thing is like, so when there's this funny story from Alfred North Whitehead was kind of the guy who got this process stuff up and running. And so he gave this Gifford lectures, which is the very prestigious lectures in natural theology in Scotland. And so he was at University of Edinburgh, New College, early 1900s, giving these lectures on like laying out this whole new process view of the world. And the way the story goes is by the end of the week, when he's giving his last lectures, there's like 5 people in the room. All of them are asleep. None of them understood what was being said, and except for Whitehead himself. And this is the way the story always goes. I don't know if it's a legend or not, but yeah. So your difficulty in understanding it is,
I believe it.
Yeah, like it's everybody's got this sort of problem. So that's what process is. And so when you're looking at these other models of God, the only thing they're going to have in common with process thought is they're going to say, well, God changes sometimes, or God gets sad sometimes, or God gets, upset sometimes. But they're not having this like overall full blown, like different, completely metaphysical view of the world. So lumping them all together in the same category is just like, what are you talking? Like, I mean, think about like all the different divisions you have in Islam, and you're like, you've got this one thing in common, so therefore you're all exactly the same. Mm-hmm. That's just not good scholarship. That doesn't make any sense. So that's the kind of thing I see a lot, is this sort of mudslinging of going, if I can like lump you all together in this category that we all agree is terrible. Like Edward Fazer, he does this a lot. He'll say, your options are divine simplicity or atheism. Wow. And I'm like, so Al-Ghazali is an atheist? Al-Maturidi is an atheist? Like all these people who follow like these kind of thinkers who go simplicity is false, Quran just doesn't fit with simplicity. Like you're all atheist. You didn't know that, but you are. You're all atheist. I'm like,
well, I guess he's trying to say, look, atheism's the only route left for you guys.
Yeah,
you can't affirm a God who exists unless he's divinely simple.
Yeah, that's supposed to be the idea, and I'm just like, I don't know, I just can't take it seriously. Yeah. There's some other examples. So Brian Davies, he has this really popular one that's kind of catched on mainly online. He has this distinction between classical theism and what he calls theistic personalism. And I think it's just a terribly inaccurate distinction, because the way he does it is he says that classical theists deny that God is a person. And he uses like Augustine and Aquinas as like supposed to be like, they're like the key like classical thinkers. And I'm like, Augustine very explicitly says to be a person and to be God is the same thing, because Augustine affirms simplicity. So he thinks God's personhood is identical to God. So what's
Davies really trying to say here? Because I mean, obviously Christians believe that God is one essence shared by 3 persons, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Is he trying to say something else?
No, like that's what's I find so deeply confused about it. So the distinction is classical.
So what's the Trinity according to Davies?
He says they'll affirm like 3 persons, but there's not a lot of detail or a lot of content there. And then he'll make this other leap of when you say person. When you and I say person, we only mean physical human beings. Mm-hmm. And I want to go, I don't speak for yourself, man. I don't think that. Like, I don't think the word person only means physical human beings. I follow Boethius, who was a classical theist, who thought that the term person was univocal between God and humans and angels and whoever else fits into that category. So the distinction, I just think it's just really weird. I don't think it makes sense. And I don't think it really tracks a lot of historical discussion. And when you come to the Trinity stuff, then I'm like, how does this work? Because apparently a person in the Trinity just means something wildly different than what we mean anywhere else in our thought. And I just go, I don't think it really is that wildly different. But hardly anyone really uses this in a lot of scholarly debates anymore. They use this distinction mainly like amongst internet Thomists. They really like to say like all those awful theistic personalists, and I'm like, cool story, bro.
Yeah, so,
So yeah,
within the Islamic camp, I know the Ash'aris deny that God is a person. I would presume the same about the Maturidis. And within the Athari or Hanbali camp, there's a difference of opinion whether one could attribute personhood to God. And I guess that would probably come down to how one defines a person.
mhm.
But so I didn't want to digress, but I just thought I would share that.
Right, yeah, because so at Lucerne, we have Legenhausen is one of our professors, and so we just had a live meeting, like a seminar with him and the students just a couple months ago on this exact question, because he was presenting like, here's all these views in Islamic thought, say God's not a person, and then he's got to debate it with the students, and all the students are just like, no, God's got to be a person. This makes no sense, and Legenhausen's just like holding his ground. It was a lot of fun. It was really good. So anyway, let me get back to the point though of like what is preventing this neoclassical view from getting like discussed sooner. One of the big problems I see is you've got a lot of ignorance of the history of ideas, in particular ignorance of the Islamic tradition, because you've got certain kinds of Christians that are really leading a lot of these discussions in philosophy of religion and in theology, and they don't really know that there are lots of people in the Islamic traditions denying divine simplicity. They're not aware of this.
Do you
They
think
don't know that
I mean, sorry to say, but do you think they even care? I mean, maybe they're just speaking about their own history and that's what they're concerned with because they're
um no, some of them, yes, because some of them they'll just say what the tradition just means is like their favorite list of dead people, and Islam's not going to be on that list of dead people. But then you'll get these really big claims from like Fazer or David Bentley Hart or whomever, a very common claim. I would have even said the same thing a few years ago. I have in fact said this a few years ago. All major theistic thinkers throughout all of history affirmed classical theism or divine simplicity. It's just common. Even people who are rejecting it in the Christian tradition now will say, yeah, all major thinkers throughout like the Western world. And I'm like, okay, I'm glad I had some friends who are Islamic scholars to tell me, Ryan, by the way, that's just
yeah,
not true.
yeah.
Because yeah, this is how common it is. And what I'm seeing now at the moment is people kind of doubling down on this sort of claim when different people like myself point out, going, Ghazali said no simplicity. It's right there in the incoherence of the philosophers. I mean, and they're like, no. He affirmed a view of simplicity. That there's just different versions of simplicity. You see, Ryan, different versions. Not any sort of version I would ever affirm, because I affirm the real, true simplicity. But there's different versions of it. And then when I look at the different versions of it, I'm like, this looks like the attributionist view. So let me give you an example of this. So John Duns Scotus, like he's very famous in Christian thought for affirming that God has distinct attributes, and then saying like they're not identical to each other, they're not identical to God. And in his own day, he is accused of denying divine simplicity. He swears, no, I affirm it. I affirm it, because he's got the Catholic authorities breathing down his neck, saying you need to affirm it. He's like, I do. Just these distinct attributes. And you'll see people like Thomas Williams or Richard Cross, who are Scotus scholars, say, yeah, I think that criticism that he doesn't really affirm simplicity, I think that's right. But then you see these other simplicity like sympathizers who are saying, no, he definitely had a version of simplicity. There's no way he would ever be so stupid as to deny divine simplicity.
Was this doctrine so important to the church that one could have feared execution if you were to publicly
at various points,
it?
yes. Yeah. So my boss, Giovanni Ventimiglia, he, in his work on Aquinas, he lays out this one moment in Aquinas's life. So in his earliest writings on Peter Lombard's The Sentences, so this was a textbook that theologians at that time, you had to give a commentary on, and that was going to be like your university lectures were just your commentary on Lombard's The Sentences. in his first commentary, he says God has distinct attributes. And his students go, yep, that's right. That's right. And then his students start getting questioned. There's this anonymous like pamphlet, like a little leaflet that goes out saying, here are these damnable propositions. So damnation's right there in it. And you're like, whoa. And what's one of these damnable propositions? Saying that God has distinct attributes. And so when Aquinas is asked about this, well, all of a sudden he's like, oh yeah, no. God doesn't have attributes. These are not just, no, they're not distinct attributes. So he changes his mind. You could say he changed his mind because of pure reason. That's fine. It just happens to coincide with this. And so, yeah, there's at various points in history where people get so animated that your eternal salvation's on the line. You could lose your job. You could lose a lot. And so I don't fully understand the context of like what Scotus's time period, like how serious it was, serious enough that he's going to say, yes, I affirm simplicity, even though he's going to say God has distinct attributes. And so here's the difference that I see in contemporary thought looking at this is I've got Christians telling me, well, he's just a version of divine simplicity because you see there's just versions of it. And then I've got someone like Ramon Harvey, who's an Islamic scholar going, well, what Scotus says looks exactly like al-Maturidi's view. And Maturidi said no simplicity. And I'm like, yeah, okay. I think I want to say, yeah, this is right. This is just not simplicity then. Because if we really kind of listen to this sort of story of there's all these different versions of divine simplicity because no one would be stupid enough to deny it, then what you're going to see with someone like Maturidi and Ghazali, and again, all these people who follow them on this point, even though they're explicitly saying simplicity is false, like apparently they're all just magically affirming it. And I think that just muddies the waters. I think this really prevents us from being able to do good historical scholarship. So it's this kind of stuff that's really prevented, I think, good debates on saying there's this distinct model of God that you see throughout history. Let's start identifying it. Let's debate it. It just becomes a mess when you've got these kind of narratives and these turf warfare going on.
Oh, it's really interesting stuff. Okay, so given our focus on divine simplicity today, could you provide a more in-depth? So I can imagine our listeners wondering, like, what on earth are you guys talking about? What is divine simplicity? So, maybe you could provide a more in-depth explanation of what this doctrine entails, and what are the agreed upon implications of divine simplicity, which is recognized by both its advocates and its critics. And I acknowledge that critics of divine simplicity may assert implications not granted by the other side. But at this stage, I'm mainly interested in understanding the common ground regarding the doctrine's implications, which everyone would agree with and say, yeah, that's what it actually teaches.
Yeah, because we don't want to jump to anything without argument yet. So yeah, so what's the common ground here? So divine simplicity is this attribute which says God does not have any attributes. And that sounds incoherent on its face, but that's not my fault. Like that's the way like you see it articulated. And so you see this like in Augustine, you see this in Moses Maimonides, Aquinas.
Would they actually call divine simplicity an attribute?
Yes, this is what's so weird. So I just did an episode of my own podcast on this recently where I say this, and then I'm like playing clips of some different thinkers, and they're like, divine simplicity is the attribute. And so and so I'm just like, it's the attribute where he has no. Okay, cool. Keep going. Because it's just so obviously weird. But this is the claim. The claim is God does not have any attributes. God has no properties, no tropes, no immanent universals, nothing of like that, like none whatsoever. Even no accidental properties. So accidental properties like being the creator, being the Lord or the judge of all men. These are accidental properties. God can't have anything like that because he can't have any properties. Which is why I find it really weird when I see a lot of these internet Thomists online saying, well, God's got Cambridge properties. I'm like, what part of no properties do you not understand? I'm sorry. It's very clear.
And Thomists are those who follow the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, right?
Yeah. The problem is like, you know how you've got different divisions like with amongst Islamic thinkers. When you're looking at Aquinas, you've got an insane number of people going, no, what Aquinas really said was this. No, what he really said was this.
So they're not monolithic. Okay.
No, not at all. No, not even close. I find it. I think there's handbooks been written on it, and they'll be like, here's 24 different, and I'm like 24 different versions. What? Okay. Anyway, so the classical theists are going to say a few more things. They'll say when we talk about God's attributes, his essential attributes, what we're saying all of those things you want to predicate of God, they're all identical to each other. So omnipotence is identical to omniscience and so on. And all those things are identical to God's essence and existence. And then, so when you think of like creatures like you and I, like we're like substances, we have properties, or we like instantiate properties, these properties inhere in us, something like that. When you're looking at the simple God, you're going to say, no, no, no. There's just this simple, undivided substance with no distinctions, no properties, nothing intrinsic or extrinsic about it. It's just God, or existence itself, or however you want to say it. Further, the simple God is purely actual, which just means no potential whatsoever. And because there's this assumption in a lot of the classical thinkers that if you possess potential and you move from potential to actual, well, then you're not going to be immutable. And remember earlier, the classical theist we talked about says God's immutable, cannot change. So you got to get rid of that kind of claim. So gods have to have pure actuality. He's never going to have potential that eventually actualizes, because that would be a change, and you can't have that.
So you said something interesting there.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, you said that, according to them, that because God is timeless and immutable, they would argue that God must be simple. But clearly not everyone agrees with that, because I mean, Imams al-Ghazali and al-Maturidi, for example, would affirm that God is timeless and immutable, yet still affirm attributes for him. So I don't want to cut your train of thought or digress, but would it be accurate to say that everyone agrees that if you do affirm that God is simple, then he must be timeless and immutable, but people disagree as to whether divine simplicity is a necessary implication of affirming timelessness and immutability?
Yes, I think that's right. The classical theist is going to disagree with both of us, though, because they're going to say, no, 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 these things all hang together. Whereas I want to go, I think they can come apart. I really do. So you'll typically see them say, like, these four attributes, they necessarily entail one another. Whereas I've written papers going, I don't see the entailment. I really don't.
So they would tell Imams al-Ghazali and Maturidi that they're being inconsistent.
Correct. Yeah. They're going to say, like, look, if you really want God to be timeless, then you're going to have to, he has to be simple. You got to, and so they're going to try to draw out these, so there's arguments to be had there. But that's, which is really good to help you kind of understand some of the background assumptions of how these classical theists are getting to simplicity. And let me mention like a few other details about simplicity. So another one is when you're looking at this claim that God's pure actuality, part of that involves the idea that God does not have a bunch of distinct actions. Instead, all the things you want, all the actions God performs are identical to each other. So there's just one act, and that one act is identical to God's essence and existence. And so you'll see people say God just is an act. So Catherine Rogers will say this, and she'll say, I know that sounds weird, but lots of things sound weird. So there's this, God's an act. What do you want? Like, it's no big deal. Now you might be going, how are we getting some of this? Like, how does it actually work?
How can an act have consciousness? How can an act? Yeah,
Right. Well, this is exact questions, and this is why, like, when you're reading Kate's work, she goes, I know it sounds weird, but lots of things sound weird when we're talking about God, so it's fine. And for me, like, I think that's super weird, but the weirdness for me also is in other places going, why do I have to say all these things are identical to each other? Like why is this? And it's because there's this other assumption in the background about mereology, or parts and wholes, and assumptions about like how parts and wholes are composed. And when you're looking at these thinkers, they're going to say just everything under the sun counts as a part. So genus, differentia, forms, accidental properties, essence, existence, these are metaphysical parts. And when I hear the kind of claim like existence is a part, so if I asked you like, oh, did you see this movie the other day? And you're like, oh, yeah, right, it was a good movie. And I'm like, what was your favorite part of the movie? And you're like, existence. I'm just, I don't know. It sounds super weird to me, but that's what you need to say to kind of understand like these people are trying to justify simplicity. They're like, all this is parts, so we can't have parts in God. So all these things are parts. So we got to have some sort of identity kind of claim. One final claim. This is very important. There's no distinctions in God. And this is the thing I've had the hardest time when I'm trying to debate Christians on this, because they just don't want to believe that this is what all their favorite dead thinkers are really saying. They're like, no. Surely they made distinctions all the time. I'm like, yeah, distinctions though. You can't have any distinctions of the simple God, because distinctions imply multiplicity, and multiplicity, according to these these thinkers apparently implies metaphysical parts. And you'll see this, the strongest claim is you can't even have conceptual distinctions in God. So conceptual distinctions that make up in my mind, those can't even apply to God. And you see this very clearly in St. Anselm. He says this in multiple places. Ibn Sina says this. Maimonides says this over and over again. And Nicole Orsamy and Catherine Rogers, they're all like, yeah, conceptual distinctions cannot apply to God because whatever can be divided in my mind can be divided in reality, apparently. So no conceptual distinctions for God. So this is the doctrine of divine simplicity.
So, in a nutshell, divine simplicity teaches that God has no attributes, even if those attributes are abstract or identity-based, so to speak. So God does not have the attribute of knowledge. God does not have the attribute of power. God does not have the rank of creator, and so on. So divine simplicity advocates would, I mean, they would still say that God knows and creates, but they do not say that he has the attribute of knowledge or can be described with the title creator. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
You would not call God creator.
Well, it's weird. So Augustine has got this long passage because he's worried about God having relational, this is what he says, relational properties like being the creator or being the Lord, because those are things that imply a relationship, because you can't be a creator unless you create something. You can't be Lord unless you've got a thing to lord over. And he's like, well, then God wouldn't be timeless. He wouldn't be immutable. He wouldn't be simple. What do I do? And he says, well, when I say that God is the creator, I'm really saying something about me, because God's not really related to the universe. So he cannot have these accidental relational properties. So I can say God's creator all day long, but somehow I'm saying something about myself. And that's the part where I'm like, I don't think you really mean that, but he says it over and over again. And you see this a lot in the Christian tradition.
All right. Okay. So now that we've, defined divine simplicity, is it similar to other theological doctrines where there are different models of divine simplicity? Because I know you pointed out that some people would refer to versions of divine simplicity. So, I mean, are there different models of divine simplicity out there?
I want to say no, because you've got such an incredibly strong claim and incredibly well-defined doctrine here that I don't know what it would mean for there to be different versions. So when you've got this claim like that God has no properties, and I'm like, well, but doesn't he have just a few properties here or there? Isn't that still simple? And I'm like, what part of no properties do you not understand? And you're like, well, God has no potential at all. And I'm like, well, can I sneak in a little bit of potential here and there? And they're like, no, what part of no potential? What is this? Where are you going on here? When I see this kind of stuff, I'm like, are you just playing with words? Like, what are you doing here? And when I look at different people today who defend divine simplicity, like Catherine Rogers or James Dozel or Steve Doobie, like they're very clear. There's no such thing as other versions. They're like, this is simplicity. If you try to like weaken it in any sort of way, you're breaking all the core claims. So it just doesn't make any sense. And I think that's right, because when I see some of these claims about other versions of it, I see people who either just kind of confused, they don't know anything about like the attributionist view in Western history. So they don't know that there's this well-established view that has a clear name attached to it. So let me give you an example of this. So Oliver Crisp at St. Andrews, I really like Oliver. He's offered this thing he calls the parsimonious view of divine simplicity. And he thinks what he's trying to do here with his model of simplicity is he says it's going to answer all the objections that Ryan has against it, because that really bothered him. All the stuff I did really bothered him. So he's like, I'll give a model of simplicity that gets out of all the objections, and it still satisfies all the things that like people who affirm simplicity want. And so you're like, okay, cool. Well, what's this view? And he's like, God has distinct attributes. These attributes are not identical to each other, and they're not identical to God, but God has these like distinct attributes. Now you might be going, well, hang on, doesn't that look like that just is the attributionist view? And I think that's right, because it looks identical to my view. It looks like Maturidi's view. In the Hindu tradition, there's this guy named Ramanuja who's a really big deal, and he says, yeah, no, God has distinct attributes. Simplicity, that's false. And what do we have in common? All of us are saying divine simplicity is false. And then Oliver's like, well, I've got the same view you do, but I call it simplicity. And I'm like, I think that's just confused. I'm sorry. When I pointed this out to him, I said, this long tradition, the Islamic thought that says simplicity is false and that God has distinct attributes. It's got a name, you know. And he's like, it's very important that we hang on to the traditional language of simplicity. And I don't understand why I should hang on to that, because that feels weird to me when I've got a clear name of something going back, you know, over 1,000 years of like, this is this thing. And I come along today now going, I affirm this, like this view, but I'm just going to call it the exact opposite of what it is. That's just weird.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly some, equivocating going on here.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's a shift away from the terminological use of simplicity to a more linguistic common day usage of it? So, Ryan, I presume that despite being an attributionist who affirms attributes for God, that you still believe that God is not a composite thing, right? Made of detachable parts. So perhaps the word simple here, as Crisp likes to use it, is being used to convey the idea that God is a single, indivisible being without detachable parts, like some kind of complex entity with patched up parts.
Right.
So obviously the equivocating is still there, right? Because you know, if you got I mean, obviously there's the common day usage of the word simple.
Yeah.
There's a terminological use of the word, a theological use of the word simple.
Yeah.
So, but
that's a very charitable reading. I think a lot of people are going to appreciate that. I still think it's wrong, and here's why. So the attributionist view, like they've always said, God does not have parts. Like I don't know any like that many people throughout history that really like think God literally has parts. You get a few people here or there, but no. In a lot of Christian thought today in the English speaking world, there's this idea of we have to sound safe. And if I say things that sound too controversial, then I'm not going to be on the safe list. So publishers are not going to publish my work. And there's a lot of this sort of stuff. So I see a lot of theologians over the last 50, 60 years in the Christian tradition saying they're affirming these really traditional doctrines, but they're taking the words to mean the exact opposite. So like when all my work that I've done on timelessness, I would see all these people saying, I affirm God's timeless. And I'm like, you've got a God who literally undergoes succession and change. How is that a timeless being? And they're like, well, it's important to keep this language. And I'm like, why? So I think there's this kind of weird sociological stuff going on.
Again, I don't want to digress, but when I researched on the Incarnation during my master's, I noticed the same thing that, and I'm not going to throw names right now, but certain theologians, because they wanted to remain faithful to the Chalcedonian statement of faith on the Incarnation, they were just clearly playing around.
I already know where you're going with this. Keep going.
The eisegesis was just very clear.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, when they were confronted, rightfully so, that they're going against the Chalcedonian statement of faith on this, they're like, no, it could be interpreted this way, it could be read this way. Yeah, but we know what how those original people in the council understood what they wrote.
Yeah,
right? You can't just come like 2,000 years later, or 1,000 years later, and start,
Bassam, you've described all of my experiences with all the publications on the Incarnation I've done and all the seminars I do, where people are like, well, we can interpret it this way. And I'm like,
So it's like what is holy are the words, not the actual meaning.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I just
want to draw that comparison.
And it's a really good one because I've seen it so many times, and it's just, for me, I'm such a, I don't know if I'm just trying to be too intellectually honest and just going like, look, I know this is what these people thought in the past, and I know I could engage in postmodern play, but I don't want to be a postmodern. So stop it. Like, let me give you one more example of this kind of stuff. Then we can move on to some other things. So in Eastern Orthodoxy, it's hard to figure out what Eastern Orthodox Christians say because they disagree on it. Just like every other branch of Christianity, they disagree amongst themselves and everything. You'll see this view attached to Gregory of Palamas, this called as essence energy distinction. And some of the Eastern Orthodox theologians will say, yeah, we affirm this view instead of that heretical Catholic view of Thomas Aquinas, his doctrine of simplicity. And again, that's their words. I'm not accusing anyone of heresy out loud. So sometimes they'll talk this way in really strong terms of like, yeah, we reject simplicity because it's heretical. Then you'll find some other people who are Eastern Orthodox going, no, we affirm a version of it, of simplicity. And I'm like, okay, so is it a heresy or is it like you're in the same, like what's going on? And then you'll see these Catholic theologians like Matthew Levering, when they're trying to deal with objections to divine simplicity, one of the moves that he makes is to go, well, no one rejected simplicity. There's this, sure, the Eastern Orthodox are criticizing, my favorite guy, Aquinas, but well, they're just wrong because they're affirming a version of simplicity too. So this, you can't object to this. You affirm the view too. It's a very clever move. Like it really is like, but I think it's a lot of smoke and mirrors because then he never really deals with the objections that he has leveled against his view. So these are the kind of ways where I typically see there's versions of simplicity. It fits into a lot of these kind of categories that I'm seeing where it's, you don't really understand that there's this well-established attributionist view in history. So you're just calling these things all simplicity because you want them to be on your side, or you're doing some smoke and mirrors to say, everyone agrees with me. You just don't know it. Yeah.
Right. So, recognizing your stance as a neoclassical theist who rejects divine simplicity, I mean, could we start exploring the primary arguments for and against this doctrine? If you could outline the arguments in favor of divine simplicity, right, the most important ones, and maybe your responses to them, and if possible, if applicable, maybe your counter responses to potential rebuttals to your responses.
Yeah. So the main philosophical arguments for simplicity, they tend to fall under what I'll call dependency arguments. Because what they have this kind of common feature is saying, like, if God has distinct attributes, then he's going to somehow depend on those attributes in some sort of way that's really, really bad. And the really, really bad parts spelled out in the different versions of the arguments. But that's the idea is if God has distinct attributes, he's dependent on those attributes in this horrible, horrible way where he's not going to be God anymore, something like that. So I can take you through three different kinds of arguments of this. And so you'll see a lot of these in different thinkers. So like Ibn Sina, he runs some of these kind of arguments. Aquinas does the same thing. And then James Dozel is a prominent defender of divine simplicity today. So here's one example of how one of these arguments goes. So it says, anything made up of other entities, anything made up of component parts, is derived from those entities and exists in dependence on those entities. But God does not derive from nor exist in dependence on any other entities, because otherwise he's not God, right? Thus, God is not made up of other entities. He's not made up of component parts. Now, if God is not made up of these other entities, if he's not made up of component parts, well, then God is simple. Well, we just said he's not made up of these other things, so therefore God is simple. It's a very straightforward argument. It's very clear cut. The problem is that the argument rests on some very controversial assumptions. And the main controversial assumption is that God's attributes, if God has attributes, those count as literal parts. But the main question that keeps coming up, but I keep noticing throughout history, is to go, why should I think that's true? Why should I think that attributes count as literal parts? I mean, Al-Ghazali hammers this point like over and over again, going like, why should I think these are parts? You've given me no demonstration that they're parts. There's just no good reason to think that God's essential and eternal attributes are literal parts. And I think that's right. And so you see this in the attributionist tradition, but you can also see it in some contemporary thinkers. So Keith Yandel and Timothy O'Connor, they make this really similar point. They'll say that, well, parts typically we say can come apart, like the whole idea of a part. And when you're talking about essential attributes by definition cannot come apart from the thing that they inhere in. So if God has essential attributes, you can't find omnipotence floating free from God. That's a metaphysical impossibility. So they cannot count as parts. So this argument, I think, it's making some assumptions that I don't see why anyone should accept them. So I don't think it gets up and running.
Okay, and I've seen some make this distinction between counterfactual dependence and causal dependence, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess what you were just describing right now is counterfactual dependence. So basically, these attributes are essential. So basically, God's knowledge exists along with God's knowledge, but we don't say that God exists and then caused his knowledge to exist. That would be the second one. The causal dependence would probably be the problematic one.
Right. Because that'd be kind of weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially if you do a different thing.
And no one's affirming.
Right.
No one's saying God existed and then caused his knowledge to come into existence. No one's saying that. I mean, it's just saying God's knowledge exists because God exists. So it necessarily exists because God exists. And so they are a single, inseparable whole. Mm-hmm. divisible. So I'm not sure what precisely is the theological objection to that. Okay, so you mentioned
Mhm.
three dependency
Mhm.
arguments. So what would be the second one?
Yeah, so the second one, this one focuses on the claim that God acquires accidental properties. Now, not everyone. So, like, if I remember correctly, Al-Ghazali doesn't like the idea that God has accidental properties, even though he rejects simplicity. But some other neoclassical theists, like myself, I want to say, well, when God creates a universe, he acquires the accidental property of being the creator. Like, I want to say that. And so this objection is going to be geared towards someone like me, saying, like, Ryan, how dare you say that? How, what's going on here? So here's the argument. So if God acquires the property of creator, which I say, yep, that's right, well, then God comes to have a part. And since Ryan, you did say God acquires the property of creator, I'm like, yeah, I did. They're like, well, therefore God has a part. Now, if God is composed of parts, then these parts are before God in being, even if not in time. I don't know what that means, but that's the part of the argument. Thus, the part creator is before God in being. Now, if something has a part, then that thing and its parts are composed by some sort of extrinsic source of unity. If you got two different things that are parts, you got to have something outside of them that bring them together to make them a unified thing. Thus, God and the part creator, they're going to have to be composed by some extrinsic thing. Like something's going to have to grab God and grab the part creator and smash them together. Well, no thing that has an extrinsic source could be the creator of all. Because if God's got a source for himself, then like that, he's not God. I mean, so God cannot be the creator. So let me put this in like a simpler terms. So basically, it's saying if God acquires the property of being the creator, then God cannot possibly be the creator. Only a being who does not have the property of being the creator can somehow be the creator. Because if God had the property of being the creator, then he can't be the creator. And if that sounds like implausible, I want to say good, because it's just an implausible claim. I just find it very confused. And I think the absurdity of it just should make you go, something's wrong with this argument. But where is something wrong with the argument is the question.
The whole idea,
Uh,
I mean,
yeah,
just the idea
yeah.
of taking a rank, a descriptive rank, like creator,
Mm-hmm.
considering that a part, it just seems so strange. Um,
Exactly. And that's the exact. So I want to go back to that attributionist claim earlier, going, why should I think these things are parts? Like, why should I think the abstract properties are parts? And you see, like Tim O'Connor, when he's trying to develop his account of unity in contrast to simplicity, he just goes, properties aren't parts. He doesn't even feel the need to justify it. He just says, he's like, we all know properties aren't parts. So God acquires the property of being a creator. Like, that's not a part. So who cares? And I think that's right. So when I've tried to ask people who work on mereology, they work on parts and wholes. Um, because it's not my main area. So I'm like, am I missing something? And when I've asked them about this, they're like, well, when we talk about parts and wholes, we're pretty much just focused on physical objects. And so when I'm like, well, what about a non-physical being like God and these non-physical abstract properties? Would those count as parts? And they just kind of go, I'm losing my grasp on what you mean by parts in this case. Because when I talk about parts, I talk about physical objects. So I'm like, okay, so good. So people who are working on mereology, who are experts on this, are going, I don't understand this objection. This makes no sense. And I'm like, okay, good. I'm not going crazy thinking this makes no sense. So I don't see why I should say
I guess we don't even
that.
have to restrict it to physical, right?
Yes.
Ryan, like it could just be concrete. So even if we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
souls, we could probably conceive
Right.
that soul is a part if we wanted. I mean, I don't know. I haven't thought about that, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe we could imagine immaterial, concrete um, entities also being a literal part. We just want to grant that for the sake of argument, but
You could.
a descriptive rank. Um, so I'm a father. I'm a husband. So
Mm-hmm.
to say that husband is a literal part of
Yeah. I mean, because we do talk in like, in common ways of saying like, yeah, the part of me that's a dad really doesn't want to do this right now. Or, but you're not being, you're being loose with language like we always are in our everyday speech. It's not a literal part. Yeah. So it just seems like you're taking loose language and trying to make it some sort of precise philosophical claim. And you're like, it's just not. It's just not. So I think that's what's wrong with this argument.
Okay. So just so that
Mm-hmm.
we're clear here, Ryan, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
uh, are you saying that God's attributes are not parts, period? Or are you saying that God's attributes could be considered parts, but they are not separable parts? They are
Mm-hmm.
inseparable from the divine essence as they subsist in the divine essence, and given that they are necessarily inseparable, the divine simplicity advocate doesn't really have a theological objection to raise. So, what exactly are you arguing here, or does the idea
Yeah.
of inseparable parts not even make sense?
I think the idea of inseparable parts doesn't make sense because a common way of understanding what counts as a part and what doesn't is it's separable. Um, but so that's one of the claims I want to make. So when I talk about the essential attributes of God, I'm like, if that's your criteria for what counts as a part, well, then these essential attributes don't. And that's why the accidental property objection can come up, because like, well, this is because accidental properties are the sort of things you don't have to have. You can acquire them. Some of them you can lose. I don't think you can lose the property of being the creator, because once you did that, you're creator forever and ever. But some other properties you can lose over time. I'm a U.S. citizen. Hopefully, I don't lose that, but I could. These are accidental properties. But I just want to look at properties and go, why should I think that properties are parts? Because I just like when Augustine talks about the simplicity of the soul, Augustine says a soul's simple, but a soul has properties, and I'm like, right, properties just aren't parts. And Augustine gets it. So and he affirms simplicity. What are these other people like Aquinas and some of these others? Why are they counting all these things as parts? So I just find the whole thing really confusing. And so I just So to answer your question is I want to say properties just full stop are not parts. When I'm talking about physical objects, I understand parts and wholes somewhat, but when I'm talking about non-physical things, I don't understand the claim here. But it depends on a lot of other metaphysical assumptions you're going to be making to try to get an argument like this up and running. But that's what makes this argument controversial, is because you have to work with a lot of other metaphysical assumptions, and not everybody's going to agree with those, regardless of whether or not you affirm simplicity or not. So this is kind of the idea.
Mm-hmm. I think the third one is called the character dependence argument. What does that argument look like?
So say you affirm this attributionist view, and you want to say God literally has all of those distinct attributes that you see in your average systematic theology textbook. So a proponent of simplicity is going to say, well, they're going to say, like, if God's attributes, like, would God like depend on those attributes in order to be who he is? That's the way it goes. Like, he's got this character, you're saying, right? He's got a character. Well, he's dependent upon those attributes to be who he is. So W. Matthews Grant, he calls this the character dependence objection. And someone like Al-Ghazali has already replied to this. So again, the first part is say, like, why should I think these are parts? Second, Ghazali's like, well, God grounds his attributes. It's not like the attributes are like there's God over here and the attributes like kind of like floating around going, oh, hey, let's glob onto that. Mm-hmm. Like, no, they adhere in God, full stop. Third, so John McGinnis has this really great paper on Ghazali and Alvin Plantinga on simplicity. And so he says, this is a quote from John McGinnis. So Ghazali dismisses the objection as mere rhetorical flourish playing to the crowd. To say that one needs precisely that which one already possesses and possesses inseparably and eternally is just to be obtuse. So when I was reading McGinnis sound, I'm dying laughing. So here's the objection when you don't put it into mystic terms, when you put it in, I think, more just plain English and more accurate terms. The character dependence objection, I think, is going to lose its force. So let me just try to explain this a bit. Is God only powerful because he has power? And I want to say, yeah. And what's a big deal about that? But a Thomist might go, well, then God is dependent upon his power in order to be powerful. And I want to go, I don't understand what you're saying. That makes no sense. Of course, God's only powerful because he has power. How else could he be powerful?
Yeah. He's also depending on the simplicity to be simple, right?
No, exactly. So I'm just like, we're just playing with words in this weird sort of way. Like, is this sophistry? Because I know you don't want to be sophist. So I think this is why I love that line from McGinnis trying to summarize Ghazali's thought. It's like, it's rhetorical flourish. You're just being intentionally obtuse. Let me put the objection a little bit differently. So you might object to the attributionist by saying, well, but you're praising God for his attributes and not for God himself. And I've seen these kind of objections in some different recent publications. And I want to just go back to Ghazali and say, you're just playing with words again. This is just rhetorical flourish. Of course I praise God for his attributes because I praise God for being perfect. What it means to be perfect is to have all the great making properties, the great making attributes. If God didn't have those great making attributes, I would not praise him. And you know what simplicity says? No attributes. And so I'm like, well, why am I praising a God that literally does not have any great making attributes? Like that, I feel like my praise is very well justified in the case of a God with actual great making attributes, where I'm looking at the simple God who has no attributes. I'm like, I don't know why I'm praising this thing.
It's like
Electrons are simple.
like someone complaining, my wife only loves me because of my good character and kindness, but she doesn't love
Right.
me. You know?
Yeah, I know. And you're like, well, that's what this is me. Like this is me. Is my character, my character, and all these things. Like what is? Yeah, it's a weird kind of objection.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, it's interesting how you're like, you're bringing up Ghazali here. So I know that you did at the very beginning try to point out that there was a historical precedent for neoclassical thought
Mhm.
in Christian history. But when do we find the first Christian thinker or theologian coming out explicitly, just like, critiquing divine
Mhm.
simplicity? What would you say that's around, like maybe the 17th, 18th century during Samuel Clarke's time, or is there
I
anyone?
don't know yet, because when I'm looking at some of these debates, so like when I told you about the story of like the young Aquinas, where he's affirming distinct attributes, and like and there was a lot of people doing that at that time, and then this anonymous pamphlet gets sent around saying that's a damnable position, and I'm like, well, you clearly have people, and I know at that time period too, there's a lot of back and forth and dialogue between different Christian thinkers in Islam. Like, I mean, Aquinas, like he quotes Ibn Sina every now and then, so like he's clearly reading some of the Islamic sources. So because it's so controversial and you could get in trouble, it's hard for me to say when exactly people were going to come right out in the open and reject it, because it looks like if you did that, you would get in trouble. So you got to be more covert about it. Whereas when you get to the scientific revolution or something, or after like the Reformation, and you've got like a separation of church and state, you don't have certain authorities breathing down your neck. You can be much more blatant and go, oh, those scholastics with their like unintelligible notions. I mean, you can start saying those things much more openly. You don't have to hide what your views are as much. You still have to hide some of your political views at that time. You're going to get your head cut off, but at least with this stuff, you could like be a little bit more open about. So it's hard to say because of those kind of historical nuances and problems.
Great. Okay, great. So here I think we took a look at the primary argument or arguments. Even though you lump them up under dependency, but I did see them as three kind of separate arguments. But how about some positive arguments against divine simplicity? You share some of your main criticisms and possibly responses from proponents of divine simplicity, how they would respond to your arguments, and possibly any counter responses from you to them.
Mm-hmm. So we'll do like I did with the last one. We're going to go through three different arguments. So the first one I'll just call the scripture argument, because you see this in a bunch of different religious traditions focusing on their own scriptures. So the big idea is this: like when I look at Jewish, Christian, Islamic, or Hindu scriptures, I don't see the doctrine of divine simplicity just laying around. Like I'm not going to find these passages that say, "Thus saith the Lord, all of my actions are identical to each other, such as there's only one to act." You don't see that. So in the Hindu tradition, Ramanuja, he gets in this big debate with Shankara, and Ramanuja goes to this painfully long and boring exegesis of like all these scriptures. It's very long. I did not like reading it. It was very boring. But he keeps hammering this point over and over again, going like, look, there's a plenitude, a multitude of all these amazing, great attributes that God has. So so God actually has them. And that's the whole kind of way Ramanuja develops his exegetical argument. And you see similar kinds of things with the Hebrew Bible, with the Christian New Testament, with the Quran. Just people going, look, right there. We can come up with a list of all the different distinct attributes that are mentioned, and we don't find anything saying that God doesn't actually have these attributes. You do find this kind of argument, though, to push back on these sort of moves. So some people will say, let's look at the Hebrew Bible. Exodus 3:14. It's this passage where Moses goes to the burning bush, and God supposedly in the morning in the burning bush, and Moses says, "Who shall I say sent me?" And God from the burning bush says, "I am who I am." People will take this sometimes to say, well, there's God saying he is existence itself. Now, when you ask your average Hebrew Bible scholar, they'll go, No. The passage is better translated as "I will be who I will be," because apparently the tense there is incomplete. It's future oriented. Because what's going on there is this idea of like, you want to know who I am? Well, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's my past. You want to know who I am? I will be who I will be. You're going to know who I am by what I'm about to do to the Egyptians. So it's not making a claim about this. It's a claim about what I did in the past and what I'm about, and promises I'm making right now for the future. It has nothing to do with I am existence itself. But you see people like Moses Maimonides saying this, but the rabbinical tradition before that, by and large, did not say these kind of things in the Jewish world. So I think these kind of passages, you're not going to get divine simplicity out of them. I don't think there's a really good way to try to argue from scripture to simplicity, but Exodus 3:14 is like the main one that people try to go to get simplicity out of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a good argument. I mean, for example, in the Quran, God negates deficiencies for himself. So he would deny that he gets tired or sleeps, and he would deny that he can die or forget things, and so on. Yet, throughout the Quran, God describes himself as the creator and with other titles, and he speaks in a manner in dozens, if not hundreds of passages as if he has attributes. Like the Quran does not only say that God knows, but that he has knowledge. And God communicates this way, knowing full well that his revelation is not only speaking to a privileged elitist group of classical philosophers. And nowhere in the Quran does God negate having attributes for himself. And, according to many of the advocates of this doctrine, I mean, denying divine simplicity is tantamount to heresy because it supposedly compromises God's unicity and oneness. But surely God would not speak in a manner in several instances that would make the common man reading scripture fall into heresy, because that would appear to run contrary to his divine wisdom. So, yeah, I mean, I think the scriptural argument is quite a robust one. So let's move on and talk about a philosophical argument. One of the arguments that you've developed is called the potentiality argument. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this one tries to focus on a conflict between simplicity and divine freedom. And what I'm doing is I'm focusing on the classical theists' understanding of divine freedom. So not like a panentheist or something, but like what a classical theist themselves are going to say about freedom. And so here's what you see a lot of classical theists say. They'll say God is free and that God is the source of his intentional actions. Intentional actions meaning like you intended to do it, you wanted to do it. So God's the source of his own intentional actions. And God has the ability to do otherwise. And when you're looking at creation in particular, the common claim is God is free to create something other than the universe that he did in fact create. So we find ourselves in this universe that God created. He didn't have to create this one. He could have created a different one. Also, God could have just said, I don't want to create anything at all. These are his options. He could have refrained from creating, could have created that universe instead of this one. He's free in these ways. So that's the claim about freedom. And I want to say that's going to generate all sorts of unactualized potential in God. So what we need to do is go back to the claim that God is pure actuality to remind us like how this goes. So pure actuality is the claim that God does not have any unactualized potential, no unactualized potential in God. So far, what I'm doing is I'm going, okay, so you guys say this is how God is free, and you're saying this is what it means for God to be pure actuality. So you guys are agreeing on this. Now I'm going to try to derive a contradiction from just those two claims. So God can create universe 1 instead of universe 2, or God could just say, I'm not creating anything at all. From here, I can start getting some contradictions. If God can create universe 1 instead of universe 2, well, then God's going to have unactualized potential. And if God can refrain from creating altogether, well, then he clearly has the unactualized potential of I could create, So you're starting to see like all this sort of unactualized potential just come out of the very claims about divine freedom. Now I can go a little bit more. So what you get now is if that's really the case, if him not creating or him creating this instead of that, and these are all cases of unactualized potential, now I've got the claim, therefore God has unactualized potential. Well, given divine simplicity, now I've got the contradiction. I've got God has unactualized potential and God has actualized potential. So I've been able to derive a contradiction from their views on pure actuality and freedom. I don't know of any like consistent or sane way to get out of this problem. I've seen a lot of people start to try to publish on this and push back on me, which is good because they should try to respond to these objections. But all I'm doing is just saying, like, and drawing out the implications of what the classical theists themselves say. And then even when I look at some other claims you see from classical theists, I think they're also just unwittingly, like without realizing it, assuming God has unactualized potential. So Augustine makes this kind of claim a lot when he's looking at the problem of evil. He says God does not do all that he could do because he's free. He's perfectly free. But that's just unactualized potential. And then when you see the scholastics kind of develop this thinking a little bit later, they make this conceptual distinction between God's absolute power and God's ordained power. God's absolute power is like all the things he could do. And then his ordained power, that's just a description of like, well, this is what he's ordained to do for our universe. And like, so you've got this whole realm of all these things that God could do. Well, that's unactualized potential in God because he could do those things. He has the potential to do that stuff. So I think, well, they're just, what they're doing is just admitting that God actually does have unactualized potential. They don't realize that that's what they're doing, but I'm like, just admitting it. So this is sort of incoherence
I think
here.
Also, Aquinas said that the atonement wasn't necessary,
Correct,
as a plan for salvation. So isn't that kind of also basically saying that there was an actualized potential for God to provide a different method of salvation?
Yes. Yeah. So what I do in the first paper I published on this topic is I look at a bunch of different Christian doctrines where you just start racking up all the different unactualized potential. So a common medieval claim is exactly one you made of there's lots of ways God could have brought about atonement. This is the one he chose because it was the best or is most fitting. It's the one that made the most sense, but he could have done otherwise. And you're like, okay, there's some unactualized potential. Another common claim you see in the Middle Ages is any of the divine persons, so the doctrine of the Trinity within Christianity, any of those divine persons could have become incarnate. Only the Son became incarnate, but the Holy Spirit could have done it. The Father could have done it. Well, that's unactualized potential in God. So you can start just racking up all sorts of things based on just looking at other claims that Christians or whatever theological system you're looking at, if they're making these kind of moves, you're going to say, well, there's unactualized potential here, 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 here. So you're going to find it all over the place.
So basically, the divine simplicity advocate is saying that the universe as we know it, with Ryan and Bassam in it, is necessary. So, but what precisely is this grounded in, according to them? Like, is their argument that God, on account of his necessary nature, necessarily willed from pre-eternity that this be the only universe that be created, or is there some other kind of grounding here?
This is what gets weird. So Gloria Frost is a medieval scholar, and she's got a lot of really good papers she's published on this in a brand new book that came brand new. I think it's like 6 months old now. That came out on some medieval views on divine action and divine contingency. So what she points out is when you're looking at people like Aquinas or Scotus or Bonaventure or like a lot of others from that time period, they'll say that the source of the contingency of the universe is the contingency that's in God's will. The fact that God is free to do X or not X, to create or not create, to create a different world. And I'm like, well, that's just building potential into God.
Yeah.
So I think the incoherence between pure actuality and divine freedom and the grounds of contingency, I think it's really, really deep. And I think it's a very serious problem for classical theism.
Great. Okay, so let's look at one more argument. I think it's the modal collapse objection. Can you tell us about that argument?
Yeah, so a modal collapse occurs when our different modal categories like necessity and contingency, when they get collapsed into just one single category. So you could have a contingency view where everything's contingent, nothing's necessary. The one I'm interested in is where everything's necessary and there's no contingency. Now, what this means is if there's everything's necessary and nothing's contingent, no one has free will, not even God. And I think that's a really serious problem for morality. It's going to be a serious problem for like your theodicy, how you deal with the problem of evil. And I think it's going to be a serious problem for just the intelligibility of reality as a whole. So when you remove all of contingency, I think you just lose anything that's intuitive. So here's how the argument goes. So divine simplicity says that all that is in God is identical to God. And anything identical to God's existence, it's going to have the same modal status as God's existence, because otherwise we're not talking about identity anymore. So God's existence is absolutely necessary. Classical theist says, yep, that's right. Well, anything identical to God's existence is also going to have to be absolutely necessary. And now, given divine simplicity, God's intentional act to create the universe is identical to God's existence, because remember, all of God's actions are identical to each other and identical to God's existence. Well, therefore, God's intentional act to create the universe is absolutely necessary. And that's going to be pretty bad, but I think it gets worse. So the medieval philosophers are clear that if God's act to create the universe is absolutely necessary, then everything that happens in the universe is absolutely necessary. They're very clear on this point. They don't want to accept the conclusion of that when they try to escape it. But here's why they think that this is the case. So God's omnipotence is infallible. If God intends to bring about X, whatever X is, it doesn't matter. That has to come about, because what God wills must come about. So if God wills, I want this timeline to come about, then it has to come about. But if his willing is absolutely necessary, the result's going to be absolutely necessary. And so, well, since his willing, this universe is identical to his absolutely necessary existence, it's absolutely necessary. And so we're going to get an absolutely necessary universe, absolutely necessary timeline. We've got a modal collapse. Everything's absolutely necessary. I think that's not great, but that's the argument.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're focusing on philosophical arguments here, but again, I mean, this just flat out contradicts scriptural passages in both the Quran and the Bible that speak about counterfactual scenarios that God could have actualized. So, I mean, it's not merely a philosophical argument.
Right. Yes.
Great. So, I mean, how did they respond to this? Like, what different responses are there to this objection, to this modal collapse objection?
Yeah, so there's several different strategies. The most common one for a long time was just to play the ineffable mystery card. So you say, like, God's unknowable, God's unspeakable, even though I just spoke about him, and I seem to know that he's unknowable, but God's beyond all comprehension. And so all of our language fails to capture what God is like. And so when I come to these modal collapse problems, well, Ryan, you're just assuming your language describes God. Well, but all our language fails to describe God. Okay, it's kind of weird, but all right. There's two kind of problems here, I think, with this move. William Hasker points out that if you play the ineffable mystery card in the face of a contradiction, you've not pointed out how you're removing the contradiction. So the argument still stands, and you're like, oh, that's not good. The second thing is, if you really want to say all of our language about God is like just fails to describe God, like when you read any sort of treatise on divine simplicity, that's a really long, detailed description about what God's like. Well, but all of our language about God fails. So all of your descriptions with divine simplicity fail. So divine simplicity is false. That's not a good way to defend divine simplicity by saying, like, my view is false. Like, so that's quite bad. Here's another common strategy. This one's really popular over the last few years since I published some of my first work on this. What I've seen here is what you do is you articulate a version of the modal collapse objection that is invalid. And it's a version that no one has ever actually offered. And then you also ignore the details of what divine simplicity actually says, and then you declare that all of the modal collapse objections are invalid. I've seen this a lot. Yeah, it's a weird straw man. But I keep seeing it. I'm like, I don't know. Just look at any of the different versions of people that actually offered. Just do that. But I keep seeing this happen a lot. So that's one strategy. Here's another one. Some people will say, like, something in my argument is begging the question. And so the argument begs the question because the proponent of divine simplicity does not have to affirm the infallibility of omnipotence, or they don't have to affirm that God performs intentional actions. So I'm begging the question against the classical theist by saying that they have to affirm omnipotence and the intentionality of divine action. This one I find really weird because I explicitly quote all these classical theists saying they affirm infallibility of omnipotence and they affirm the intentionality of divine action. And I didn't think that you beg the question by quoting your opponent saying those things that they do in fact say and the things that they do in fact affirm. So I find this one really weird. But let's just like kind of go with the strategy for a little bit, see what's going on here. So the idea is that, like, the claim is God's going to perform one blanket action that somehow is the same across all possible worlds. And then further, what they'll say is there's this indeterministic link between God's cause and the effect. So here's the idea. You could say, like, God wants to create our universe. And he snaps his fingers, but since there's this indeterministic link between his cause and the effect, nothing happens. You're like, oh, okay. And then God's like, let's try this again. And then he gets a completely different universe. He's like, that's a terrible universe. That's not the one I wanted, And you're like, okay. And he snaps his fingers again and eventually gets our universe. And I'm like, that doesn't look like an omnipotent being. This is a being without power. It's definitely not maximal power. So I think this is a really weird, sort of silly view of God, and it's certainly not going to be what the classical theists themselves have actually said, since they actually do affirm the infallibility of omnipotence. Here's another way to do it, though. So instead of focusing so much on the indeterministic link, you say God doesn't actually perform intentional actions. So he's just existing as a pure act, whatever that is, and somehow a universe just happens to exist. He didn't intend for it because he doesn't have intentions, but the universe just kind of comes into being. Now, if you think that God is all wise and that he has a wise and loving plan for the universe, well, you've just given that up entirely. If you think God's perfectly rational, you've given that up entirely, because God's actions are not for reasons. So if our strategy to defend divine simplicity on this point is to either give up omnipotence or give up perfect rationality, you could do that to affirm simplicity, but that's a really, really wild move to try to affirm simplicity. And it's certainly not going to be defending classical theism. So I think that's quite a serious problem. Let's look at one more strategy. So this one I see in like Ibn Sina and Catherine Rogers. So this one involves two steps. First one I call obfuscation. They don't call it that. That's me calling it that. And then the second one is they just kind of shrug their shoulders. I'm like, meh. So let's focus on the obfuscation for a second. So the obfuscation is this. So the conclusion of my modal collapse argument says that everything is absolutely necessary, like absolutely everything. What you do in the obfuscation stage is you change the topic. You say, well, look, the created world is causally dependent upon God. Only God is utterly independent, and the universe is dependent upon God. And I want to go, well, yeah, that's fine, but you change the topic. Like, I mean, my argument assumes that the universe is dependent upon God. I never said the universe is independent. I don't know where you're getting that from. My argument is that everything is absolutely necessary. That's the serious problem here. So stop changing the subject. That's it doesn't really remove the modal collapse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I mean, just to touch on that last point. I mean, okay. What if the divine simplicity advocate just bites the bullet, and he would say, look, yes, this universe and everything in it is necessary, but that's not theologically problematic. God is the only necessary being in the sense of being eternal and unperishable on account of his own nature and essence. He is uniquely necessary in that he is always necessarily existing. And as for created entities being necessary, they are unlike God because they're not always necessarily existing, because they're not eternal, and they're prone to perish. And moreover, the necessity of their existence is not grounded intrinsically in their own nature, but rather extrinsically in God's necessary will. And they would say that this is something important to point out to demonstrate, not changing the topic. It's important to point it out because this shows that in no way does the divine simplicity stance violate God's uniqueness of being the only true necessary being. And once again, they would say that God's existence is not grounded in any other entity's existence, which is unlike the existence of created entities, whose necessary existence is only made possible due to God's existence. Therefore, the necessity of God's existence is completely unlike the necessity of created entities. So there's no theological problem in affirming that created entities necessarily came into existence due to God's pre-eternal single will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is similar. Like I said, you see this in Ibn Sina and you see this in Catherine Rogers, and I'm starting to see it in a lot of Southern Baptists in America, kind of going, yeah, fine, modal collapse, meh, shrug your shoulders. Seeing a lot of Catholics starting to do this too. Here's what I find weird about this is when you look at the details of the modal collapse, what you get is no one has free will, not even God. And I want to say that's a really serious problem. Sometimes you'll see some Calvinist Christians, what they'll say is, well, we still have compatibilistic freedom and God has compatibilistic freedom. And I want to say that's not compatibilism. Read a book about compatibilism and learn what compatibilism is. What we're talking about is a full-blown fatalism for God and everything else. So no one has free will.
So this
Here's
is
some of the
actually worse.
implications.
This is actually worse than the Jabriya compulsionist view, because they would deny free will for everyone, but not for God.
But not forgot exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm, mm,
Yeah. So yeah, because when you're looking at like occasionalist views or theological determinism or something, you're still seeing the
mm.
claim that
Yeah.
God has like libertarian freedom. God could do this or that, or nothing's like causing God to do these things. This is God doesn't have options. It cannot possibly have options. So it's removing any sort of notion of freedom from God. And so I think that's very serious. And then you can start seeing some of the knock-on effects in other areas of your theology. So think about like some of those sins you've committed. Is God going to punish you for those sins? Well, yeah. But you couldn't do anything other than commit those sins, and God couldn't do anything other than like cause you to commit those sins, and couldn't do anything other than punish you for those sins. Like there's no other options. You literally have like no choice. When we talk about the problem of evil, a very common claim is to say this instance of evil, God could have prevented it. He could have, but he had a good reason to allow this case of evil to happen. Part of his greater good, part of like his plan, something, you've got to say, like, this is a common move you see in theodicies. Well, if you've got this modal collapse, that's all false. God could not have prevented that evil. The role of him having a reason to permit it, that just goes out the window because there's no options. God could not have done anything else. That's really, really a serious problem for even articulating an answer to the problem of evil. And then it also just seems like it's just very implausible. So think about the electron that's floating just next to your left elbow. Most people weren't thinking about any electrons floating near you, but yeah, you've got an electron floating near your left elbow. Could it have just been like a smidge more to the left or a smidge more to the right? And it seems like, well, yeah, why couldn't it? It couldn't if you have a modal collapse. Like everything has to be exactly the way it is. The way things are is the only way they could be. And I think that just completely destroys any notion of divine freedom or human freedom, any notion of divine providence, any sort of story of theodicy, any sort of story of morality. Like it just has a lot of very serious knock-on effects. So I think we can't just shrug our shoulders. I think it's a very big deal, philosophically, scientifically, theologically. I think it's very serious.
Do they resist this concomitant? Do they resist that partial determinism is an implication of their view? I'm just trying to imagine. Can they believe? Can they actually argue back and say, yeah, God created this necessary universe, but within this necessary universe is free will. And so, yeah, it is necessarily the case that Ryan and Bassam were created with free will in this universe. So, I could understand the hard determinism when it goes back to God here. Because clearly there is unactualized potential. There was no other choice but to will that single will. That's clear to me, but I'm wondering whether they could argue back on the point when it comes to us, the creatures. Like, oh, yeah, this universe is necessary, but it necessarily is in a way whereby we have free will, and therefore it's not unjust. I'm just
So Catherine Rogers tries to do this in some of her earlier work, but she points out a problem that her view faces, because if you've got God ultimately explaining this is the way the world is, and it's God's like own nature and his existence that are entailing this modal collapse. So God's existence explains the way the world is. And now you try to build in, well, we've got free will. So our free will explains the way the world is. And that's going to explain why God did the things that he did. And well, since the things that God did are God's existence, our free will explains God's existence. And you're like, Hank, whoa, I feel like I wasn't supposed to go there. I'm supposed to be like, I'm somehow like determining God's existence and nature. Like that's not right. And so this is a problem that Kate points out for her own view when she tries to make this move. And I think it's a really serious problem, because like I should not be determining God's existence. Like that should not be a thing I'm capable of doing. But this is the entailment that she points out. And so I think it's quite, I think it's a really bad move.
Are there any bad arguments you commonly see against divine simplicity that you would advise us to avoid?
Yeah, so Alvin Plantinga in the 60s, he wrote this book called Does God Have a Nature? And he runs this argument that's widely discussed like from there until today. And so the argument goes like this: all of God's properties are identical to each other such that there's just one property, and then God's identical to that property. Well, so God is a property. And you're like, whoa, okay, that's weird. And you're like, so a property created the universe? I'm sorry, but properties don't have causal power. That they can't. And Plantinga's like, right, yep, this is really absurd. So simplicity is absurd. Get rid of it. Here's the problem with this. I don't think you can get the argument up and running because simplicity says no attributes, no properties, no universals, none of that stuff. Like, so that first premise of Plantinga's argument should go that, well, this is just wrong. So don't do this argument again. I really prefer people not do it. But I want to let me be fair to Plantinga. When you look at a lot of the literature, you do see that first claim, because earlier you asked, like, well, do people really say like God has the attribute of not having attributes? Like, yeah, they do. So when you're looking at all the literature, people really do affirm that first premise of all of God's properties are identical to each other, such that there's just one property. And so you can see that the confusion here, I think, is the fault of the people in a lot of the contemporary literature writing on simplicity. So Rebecca Rice, she's written a more recent paper trying to just examine, like, here's all the issues related to simplicity. And she points out how confusing this is. She's like, well, which is it? Are you saying that God has properties and they're all identical to each other? Or are you saying that God does not have any properties? Because it's got to be one or the other. That they don't really make sense together. So I think this argument from Plantinga, I can see how you get there, because there's a lot of confusing statements in the literature. But let's try to not be so confused about this and move on.
Fantastic. So wrapping this up, can you recommend any reading materials for our listeners who wish to dive deeper into this subject?
Mm-hmm. So I've written on this topic a lot. One of the places that's probably the most up-to-date discussion that's in print right now is this paper I did with Shannon Bird. It's called Divine Simplicity and Modal Collapse, a Persistent Problem. And it's in the European Journal for Philosophy of Religion. I've got it online, so you can download it for free. And the bibliography is very extensive. So if you're just trying to see, like, who are all these different sources, pro and con, who's in favor, who's against it, you'll see a lot of stuff there. Right. The other one is one I quoted earlier, the John McGinnis paper. I really like this one. It's relatively recent. It's in religious studies. It's called Simple is as Simple Does, Plantinga and Ghazali on Divine Simplicity. And McGinnis is like a top-rate medieval scholar. And so it's good. It's very funny. It's like it's very well written. So yeah, I would recommend those two.
I think you just like the Ghazali obtuse remark.
I loved it. It killed me. It absolutely killed me when I read it.
Great, fantastic. So I mean, what current projects are you engaged in, and like what can we anticipate seeing from you in the near future?
Yeah, so I've got a bunch of books I'm slowly writing, but there's two that I've finished very recently. So I'll just mention those. The first one is called Eternal in Love, a little book about a big God. It's going to be through Cascade. It's just my own thinking on the nature of God, creation, and providence, what I think about God right now, because my views might change, because I'm relatively young. It'd be really weird if I figured out all the things about God right now. But so it's my thinking about God right now, and it's somewhat devotional. It's way more sarcastic than any other publisher lets me get away with. So it's so everybody who's been reading through it, the manuscript right now, they've just said how, like, entertaining it is and how, like, moving it is, which I didn't know I could write things that are moving. But yeah, and it's philosophically rigorous. So it'll actually be very cheap too. It's not going to be one of these big academic books. It's going to be like $20. Should be, I think, this summer is when it comes out. Because that's at least what the publisher told me. Like, they're hoping for this summer. The second big book, this is a major academic book with Routledge. It's a sequel to my Into the Timeless God. So it's called From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker, Explorations in God's Temporality. I have never seen anything like this out in print, so I'm really proud of this finally getting to see the light of day. It's a really thorough examination of divine temporality that no one's ever done. And I try to trace out the history of each model of God as best as I can, because no, it's not really been done very well either. And then I go into all sorts of issues related to the metaphysics of time, temporal ontology, personal identity over time. And I try to see all the theological entailments for life after death, resurrection, Trinity, divine providence, creation, like a whole host of stuff. And then I try to have a deep engagement with Jewish, Christian, Islamic, and Hindu sources. So I'm trying to bring in all the different world religions together on a lot of these different topics. So you're going to see interesting questions pop up, like, why didn't God create the universe sooner? Be like, well, here's what some Muslim thinkers think about it. Here's what some Jewish and Christian thinkers think about it, and go on from there. So I've never seen anything else like this. So I'm really proud of this one to finally come out.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I mean, Ryan, I just want to thank you for your scholarship and educating us about divine simplicity. And we hope to have you back again on Blogging Theology. I know we had you before discussing divine temporality, but I'd love to have you back on diving deeper in a similar fashion as we did today. I mean, you got me excited about your upcoming book on divine temporality. So you got to come back and talk about it.
Sure. Yeah.
Great. With that, I'm going to part you and our listeners with the Islamic greetings of Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Take care.